So I'm starting work on the T-1000 claw, and the first thing I've done is made up a capping piece out of my recipe that I've used to pick up the more detailed pieces of the pattern pieces that I've created. The thing that I'm doing a little bit differently this time around with the mould box is I'm making up a sacrificial half. So what I've done is to take the first part of the box and completely fill it with sand. It's packed fairly hard on the top bit there, which will end up being the bottom, so that when I flip that over I can carve out down to the centre line of the pattern piece so that I can repack the other box on top of that, and this will be, as the name suggests, sacrificed to the system. So this will be all broken up and the sand will then be reused and repacked to get the higher degree of detail out of the second packing. The reason why I'm doing that is because this has got such a high wall structure. I want to minimise that as much as possible by getting as close to the centre line as possible, and that should give me a fairly good chance of being able to remove it out of the sand without too much side collapsing. So what I'm doing is just carving this out to the point so that the centre line of the pattern piece matches the centre line of the box where the two halves come together. So normally if I was doing this as a regular mould, I'd be dusting this surface so that the two halves would separate. At this stage I don't want to do that because I want to create that centre line seam point. Once all that's done, I will then dust it so that I can then put that top box on. This is a much looser pack than normal. At this stage it's quite literally all about finding that centre line. So now that I've got a good centre mark out there, I can add the dusting to it and add that second box on top. See now why this becomes the sacrificial piece, because these parts aren't packed in nearly tightly enough, and the underside here you don't have nearly as much detail as there should be. So this is now broken up and it's all sort of crushed back to its powdery form and then reused to do that same mould over again. Now I can reintroduce that to a piece that I know has already separated cleanly. Theoretically, because I've already had one good separation there, it means the next mould piece that I create should separate just as easily as that did a second ago. This box is starting to get a little bit old. I'll be retiring it soon. It's been burnt around the edges and that sort of stuff, but it's still working fairly well for this one. So let's see what we've got. Yep, it's there. We've had a little bit of disruption on the side there, but that's not unusual. Should be able to push that back in fairly well. Now, normally this box would be my top box, but because of that disruption, I will probably make it the bottom box, because I don't want that sand collapsing back into the mould. But other than that, we've got really sharp detail in there, so that should be pretty good. Okay, so now we have to get that piece out, but I also have to maintain this piece as well. So small amount of breakaway around the seam area is not a big deal because that's easily cut off in the cleanup. It's mostly these really flat surfaces as I want to be sort of free of any inclusions in the middle. So it's really just a matter of having that surface as clean as possible. The other thing I've got to do is get the end cap piece that maintains my detail put back in there as well. And what I've found to do that is just a very light spray. This is an empty bottle, so it just has water in it. But just a very light spray reconstitutes the clay that's in the sand and becomes like a glue layer that allows that to bond a bit better and not float around when the molten metal's put in there. So just a very light spritz. Should be able to reposition that piece so it's that way. Just sprinkle a little bit of sand into that got enough room there that it's not going to be a seaming issue. Again, it just makes a slightly better bond as far as that's concerned and stops this piece from moving around when the molten metal is introduced. So making sure there's no high spots on it at all. The last thing I need to do now is to cut pathways in so that the metal has pathway in and a pathway out. This one's going to be my riser. The other thing to think of when you're doing pieces that you're trying to get a high degree of detail out of as far as metal inclusion is to try and leave the point where you pour the metal in and the riser point a reasonable distance away from the piece that you're actually casting itself. I could have put that piece directly on top of the part that's been cast, but that would give me two problems. Number one, it would leave me a big chunk of metal that I'd have to cut off the piece, and the other thing that it tends to do is that as the metal's poured in, the rush of the heat and gases really need somewhere to escape. So if you have an area that's a good flow in and then a good flow out, any of the little particular pieces that might be trapped inside there have got somewhere to go, as opposed to pouring it directly on top of the piece, where it sort of might run down a dead end and all those little inclusions of little fragments of sand that's been left in there end up pooling in one spot and create defects in the metal. You can see I'm cutting a pretty large pathway in here. That's because it is a pretty big chunk of metal that I'm trying to cast here, and I'm just trying to really minimise that likelihood of shrinkage in the metal. This one doesn't have to be as big because the metal at this end obviously isn't as thick, but again, as I was saying, I want to have somewhere that should there be an issue as far as little particular pieces are concerned, I've got somewhere to eject out rather than be trapped in it. The other thing I'm doing with this one, because it's a little bit different, is because there's just a slight potential area that bit where it broke off could collapse into the mould. I'm going to set this into position and bring the two halves together in a little bit more of a horizontal orientation so that they're gripping those parts together. Before I do that is to give this a hit with a blowtorch just to cook out a little bit more of the moisture that's associated where I gave it a spray and in some of the moisture that's in this piece itself. The other thing you'll see me do with chunky pieces like this is to add some tin cans to the top of the mould. It just gives a higher volume of metal that inside core can start to pull from as the internal structure starts to shrink and crystallise. So the big thing with this type of moulding is that when everything goes well, it's very boring. Nothing really happens. The cans fill up and it has a nice chrome cap to it, and then it sort of starts to shrink back in as the metal's drawn into the centre of the mould, as opposed to when everything leaks out and catches on fire, or there's a huge sort of outventing of gas or something, and it's all very dramatic. So hopefully, if all goes well now, we'll be able to melt down the metal and have a very boring finish. So that's it now with all the bits cut off, and it's picked up the crystalline structure on the end there fairly well. I'm pretty happy with that. Overall, the seam lines and that sort of stuff are pretty well, and there's no major issues as far as any of it's concerned. So now on to the major work of doing the proper cleanup. But that's going to be the next step in the process. So that's the update for this time, guys. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.